essential people who have to talk all the time. But my focus primarily is with the jurors. Of course, our camera person, I noticed they tend to wear masks, and most others do not. And some clerk personnel. Yes, sir.
Your Honor, my only other concern is, well, I understand the clerk of court is out with COVID.
Yes.
And one of her...
And her staff, they've been tested and they're all negative.
I don't know what to say. I mean, I want to make sure that this, as you do, that this jury does not infect each other, and then we're in a position none of us want to be.
Or infect me or you. We all have that same concern, and the jurors are aware of that, and they have a positive attitude about it, and according to the doctor who administered the test to them this morning.
The last question would be, do you have masks? That I didn't bring a mask. Do we have
I have one right here, and my clerk has one right there, and we have a few others in the back. You're welcome to have one of them if you would like to have it. The clerk staff, she's going somewhere. Are you heading towards Mass or something?
Are we good? Yeah. Okay, we're good, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Waters.
Yeah, I was going to echo the same concern that, if we have the two who are released and then we have it kind of spread through those that are remaining, and again, this is not what I want to do at all, if some sort of delay to see what happens, because in talking with the defense as we first heard about these issues, I think we were both in agreement that we would rather, if forced to delay a little bit rather than end up with a mistrial and be unable to continue at all. And that would just be my only point that I would raise at this time. And we could have two. If we go ahead and release them, then we could have some others become symptomatic, and we just have to wait a few days for it to run its course. But that would be my only thought and recommendation. But obviously, you've had a doctor come in here and discuss a course of action.
And Your Honor, we would concur that, again, trust me, I'm not interested in delaying this at all. But what I don't want is to run the risk that we have a mistrial because they all get COVID or they all get symptomatic. It just seems to me if by Wednesday they know, it might be prudent to adjourn for a couple of days. I'm not questioning your decision. I'm just concerned that we not, and if they have masks on, that's great, but when they go back in the jury room to drink the water or have lunch or whatever they're going to do, they'll have those masks off. It's not 100%. I caught COVID the first week of the second week of December. It took me 3 weeks to get over it, and I don't want to lose this jury.
We don't want to either. And again, if we were going to do that, I would say then with the two that have tested positive, we would, at least keep them in the bullpen, I guess, until we figure that out or see what happens over the next couple of days.
The two with COVID, they have been released from jury service, and here's the mask carrier is right behind you there. Yeah, fortunately, we selected, wisely selected 6 alternates, and we'll be down to 5 or 4 following 3 following the release of these 2. And of course, we have no way of knowing. We just have to take precautions, as we all do, as we navigate through life during this period of time. And we need 12 to deliberate, so that's the goal. That's why you have alternates. Of course, anytime you have a trial that's protracted, that goes on and on and on and on, then you run a natural risk of attrition, which we are experiencing now. be it COVID or some other problem, the longer we stay here, the longer something will happen to various folks involved.
All I say about how long this is going on, I'm reminded of a quote from Jerry Spence, the famous trial lawyer in the Silkwood case. In that case, which went not much longer than we are, he said, "We began this trial in the winter, we finished it in spring. I thought we would grow old together." So I'm beginning to feel much like Mr. Spence, but hopefully we can finish the state's case this week and we can begin our case.
Yes. With regard to selection of the next 2 jurors to become part of the 12, the clerk has placed the juror numbers of the remaining jurors in a box. And statute requires that they be selected, I think the word is by lot. Any objection to a clerk, member of the clerk staff selecting the next 2? All right, if you will pull number 1, Madam Clerk. All right, and you can tell us what juror number it is.
Juror number 441.
Number 441 becomes a member of the regular panel. And the next one?
Juror 326.
Number 326 will become.
No juror numbers of those that were excused.
Yes, of course. The jurors who now been excused, juror 220. Is that correct, Madam Clerk? Yes, sir. 220 and 528. Yes, sir.
Mr. Waters and I are responding as this develops, and I'm not trying to, it's a joint concern. We have a huge gallery out here. Are we exposing ourselves to more risk by having them there?
Yeah, probably so.
Having brought that to your attention,
Would you like me to issue a mask mandate for everyone in the courtroom? Other than witnesses who are testifying and people who have to speak openly in court, like the judge and lawyers?
yeah, I think it would mitigate it.
Well, and aside from a mask mandate, we might, have a little bit of social distancing, a little less numbers might be warranted. I mean, none of us want to limit anything, but we're in a different paradigm, and both of us have a concern about getting this thing to the end without COVID causing it to fall apart. And that's the paramount concern for both the state and the defense and the court, I know.
And Your Honor, half our alternates are gone now. Half our alternates have gone. We're 3 weeks in, 3 jurors down. At this rate, we could have a problem.
We need to have somebody give a little thermometer thing at the door.
We'll leave all that with the clerk staff. They are able to monitor that, I believe. I'm not going to order any social distancing. It mean we cannot order any social distancing with the jurors. Of course, when COVID came in initially, we reversed the courtroom and had the jurors seated in the audience, and that was our means of keeping them socially distanced. I think we can require masks because people who are in the audience are here for the most part of their own volition, and they can watch it all on TV if they do not wish to wear masks. But I'm not going to order any social distancing, and for the moment we're going to encourage everyone here to mask up for your own protection as well as the protection of these proceedings and of each other. And then we'll explore how far we need to go with that as the day progresses. Otherwise, is there anything else before the jury comes?
Your Honor, one other matter, and just to let you know some developments over the weekend. Back in March of 2022, there had been search warrants prior to that issued to GM, in particular for OnStar data. And in March of 2022, GM sent a letter to law enforcement, to SLED, in which they advised, aside from some basic sort of ownership information and that sort of thing, that they had no data. Late Friday after court, Friday evening, I got a call from John Conrad, who, of course, as Your Honor is aware, has been handling a lot of that digital evidence, who had received a communication from GM stating that probably because the trial was going on and maybe in response somebody was watching the testimony of Fafosky, that they had gone back and looked again, and this time they found a lot of data that includes GPS location data from the Suburban that was that the defendant had on June 7th, 2021. That information came in Saturday evening, and I had a chance, of course, to look at it Sunday morning. I immediately called Mr. Griffin, and we talked, and we provided that information to them. And so that information's come in. Of course, when we became aware of it, the GM actually sent a letter with it saying, yeah, we told you back in March we didn't have anything, and we just found it, and here you go. And so we've actually had that data and provided it to the defense. Obviously, we'll let the defense speak for themselves, but we've done everything to facilitate their review of it. If anything, I think it confirms a lot about the timeline that we're both working within. So I don't know that they have any objection about that. We're just trying to absorb it on the fly. It is a substantial amount of information. But I wanted to raise that to the court's attention and of those developments, and of course, let the defense speak for themselves.
Your Honor, again, it is a massive amount of data, which we forwarded to our experts last night. They're beginning to look through it. Some of it is very helpful to us. We don't see it in any way contradicting the state's previous timeline, but the data can show you car speed, can show you GPS exactly where they were. It can show just many, many, many things that we did not have before. And again, we can, this is not about who didn't do what when GM concedes they didn't give it. The problem is, there's not a problem. They're going to bring somebody from GM to authenticate it, as I understand it, and then give it to their expert, who they were going to use for a timeline anyway, and have him or her digest it. We will not be able to cross-examine their expert until our experts have a chance to digest it on a granular level. So I'm just giving the court a heads up. We got it to them yesterday. We suspect it's going to take them 2 or 3 days to do that. And so I know we're talking about having their rest of the case by Wednesday, and we're going to try to get ready by Wednesday. But I can't guarantee. I mean, again, we just got it yesterday. So the only hang up that once they authenticate it, before we cross-examine their expert, we need an opportunity to have our experts advise us what, if anything, we need to ask them. I mean, that's just, how it works.
Your Honor, just to be clear about this particular data, there's 2 sets of data. The most important data to what we're doing, and again, is confirmed by the timeline. It's just actually confirmatory of the timeline that we've been presenting to this jury. But we have specific location data points that are being logged every 30 seconds or so or something like that, as well as vehicle speed. That's the crucial data that's in this from the relevant time period. There's another file that has some various sensor data that's logged, but in our initial review, I don't think there's going to be anything in that information that's going to be helpful to either side. And actually was talking with the defense counsel earlier, and they were able to load already, because I was going to suggest they do this, load that location data into Google Earth, and it works pretty well. So I think it's something that's going to be able to be digested fairly quickly, and at least in our review, it does not appear that there's any information in there that's different than the timelines that we were already working from. It's just much more specific and confirmatory of what had already been established.
Your Honor, with all due respect to Mr. Waters, his opinion on what's important to us is not, we find things in that other data he talks about that's not relevant or not of interest to them, that is of interest to us. An expert's you can't load it into Google Earth. You have to do some things with it to get it in a position. I mean, Mr. Barber, who's our computer whiz kid, was able to do the Google stuff yesterday, and indicates the other materials, the car function, are the doors locked, are they unlocked, is it in gear, is it not in gear, and the information about other functions of the vehicle. It's just amazing what they capture. I mean, it's scary because they know everything about how you're operating your vehicle, and speed, where you are, all those sorts of things. We're getting that, and our experts are downloading it. We think there's some relevance to those other databases, but I can't represent to you here today that it is or it isn't, but we have seen a couple of things we think they're going to be very helpful to our case. So all I'm attempting to do, and let me make this clear, there's nothing, we're not implying in any way the state did anything untoward here. I want that perfectly clear. Now, GM, after all the money we gave them to bail them out, couldn't get this done. That may be another matter altogether. And somebody must have been watching the trial, because between the time the FBI agent testified and they got the data, it was less than 2 days, as I understand it. So somebody hit a button and generated that data in less than 40 hours or 48 hours. So it wasn't hard to access. Again, the state had nothing to do with this delay. I just wanted to raise with the court before they call their timeline expert. We may need some period of time to get our experts to get it digested and then get back with us.
At its core, it's an unexpected witness coming into the trial. I know there have been some cross-examination on that issue in general. So the state has now disclosed an additional witness, and certainly in fairness to the defense, you should have an opportunity to adequately prepare to confront that witness if need be, and I'm sure that witness is down the line, not the next witness the state is calling, since the state indicated that you expect it to be through on Wednesday, and that did not include this witness. So you must have other witnesses and that you should be ready to proceed with, and we'll deal with the other issue as it might come up.
And Your Honor, we'll keep you posted. We're going to, we're in court from 9:30 to get back till 6 or 6:30 to be able to talk to experts. So we're going to have to talk with them tonight. But again, we're somewhat constrained as to how much discussions we can have and at what time.
Understood.
Thank you.
And Your Honor, again, we're having to digest it as well, but it's going to be incorporated in our timeline witness, who, yes, is not expected to be called, late tomorrow or Wednesday.
Anything else before the jury comes?
Nothing from the state, Your Honor.
Nothing from the defense, Your Honor.
Bring the jury. All right, very good. Good morning. Okay, day number 16. Ladies and gentlemen, you might notice that a few of your jurors are missing. Those jurors have been excused. I see many of you are masked up, but we hopefully we do everything we can to keep everyone safe, including members of the court. I'm not going to order any wearing of masks by jurors, but encourage it. But we have excused 2 jurors and now we'll have 2 other jurors who will move up to be among the first 12 jurors. And that means we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, still have 3 alternates remaining. So juror number 441. Who's 441? All right. Number 441, you're a member of the first 12, and juror number 326. 326, you're a member of the first 12. Of course, it doesn't matter where you sit. You just need to know that. And with that, we're ready to move forward. State's case, next witness.
Thank you.
The state calls Ryan Kelly.
Yes, ma'am, I do. Ryan Kelly, Kelly.
Your Honor, for the record, we're calling Agent Kelly for limited purposes this morning.
Yes, ma'am.
Agent Kelly, could you please tell the jurors where you work?
I'm a special agent with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED.
Okay. And what is your position at SLED?
I'm a senior special agent.
And in your position as a senior special agent, were you involved in the investigation into the deaths of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
I'm going to ask you to take a look at some exhibits here. State's Exhibit 464.
Yes, ma'am.
Could you tell
Yes,
us what
ma'am.
that is?
These are the buccal swabs of Philip Beach, Renee Beach, Robin Beach, and John Murdaugh.
And State's 465.
These are the buccal swabs of Ronald Freeman. Let's see.
466.
The buccal swab of Michael List.
467.
The buccal swab of Matthew Luce.
And 468.
It's a buccal swab I'm trying to see. It's a buccal swab of Curtis Smith.
And Agent Kelly, who collected those buccal swabs?
I did.
Okay, and how did you collect them?
We have a process where we put on rubber gloves and we have Q-tips that are sealed. We break the packaging, unseal the Q-tip. We insert one Q-tip into the side of their cheek and we obtain a buccal swab sample. We then remove the Q-tip, seal it in an envelope, seal the envelope. We then take the second Q-tip, which is in the packet, we break the seal, insert it into the other cheek where we swab. That Q-tip is then secured into a sealed envelope, and then the 2 separate sealed envelopes are then placed into a third envelope where it's sealed and signed an initial on the seal.
And you did that with each of these buccal swabs?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to admit State's Exhibits 464, 465, 466, 467, and 468.
Still good.
Your Honor.
They are admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. We have no further questions for Senior Special Agent Kelly at this time.
Cross-examination.
No questions.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Your next witness.
Rachel Nguyen.
You're from the testimony about the security of the trial shall be the truth shall help you God. I do. You can adjust the mic if you have to. State your name again, please, for the record. Spell your last name.
Rachel Nguyen, Nguyen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Agent Nguyen, could you please tell the jurors who you work for?
I work for the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, most commonly known as SLED.
And how long have you worked at SLED?
I've worked at SLED for approximately 8.5 years.
Could you pull the microphone a little closer so we can make sure to hear you or speak up a little? Thank you. And what is your position at SLED?
I am a forensic scientist within the DNA casework department at the SLED Forensics Laboratory.
So what does that mean? Tell us a little bit more about your job.
Like my job duties?
Yes.
So I am responsible for direct DNA analysis when requested by a DNA analyst. What that is the beginning portion of the laboratory section component of DNA analysis. That involves DNA extraction as well as DNA quantitation. Extraction meaning to separate any possible DNA from the sample, such as a swab or a cutting. And quantitation would be to see how much, if any, is present in a sample. I'm also responsible for serology analysis as well as evidence processing. Serology analysis is body fluid identification. At SLED, we test for blood, semen, and saliva. Evidence processing would be to process items for possible touch DNA or ownership DNA. Touch DNA would be to retrieve any possible DNA on an item from handling it. Ownership DNA would be potentially retrieving any DNA from wearing an article of clothing. In addition to those types of analysis, I also issue reports on my findings when appropriate. I am able to technically and administratively review reports by other serologists, and then I provide courtroom testimony when required.
Now, you must have some kind of special training and education to be able to do these things. Can you tell us about that?
So I have 2 Bachelor's of Science degrees from the University of New Haven, one in forensic science and one in biology. Upon being employed within the DNA casework department, I underwent approximately a year-long training program under a court-qualified forensic serologist. During this time, I was able to observe as well as practice the different types of serological analysis as well as evidence processing. I was also taught how to issue reports based on any findings, as well as technically and administratively review any reports issued by other serologists. I also was able to observe courtroom testimony. At the end of my training program, I then underwent a competency testing phase. This phase is to test my knowledge and abilities to perform these types of analysis independently. The competency testing phase was comprised of 4 elements: a written exam, an oral exam, a mock case to perform analysis on, as well as mock courtroom testimony. Once those 4 components were successfully completed, I was then deemed able to perform independent analysis on casework. In addition to my serology and evidence processing training, I also, as I mentioned, am trained in direct-to-DNA analysis. That was also an approximately year-long training program under a court-qualified DNA analyst. During that time, I was able to observe as well as practice the different types of protocols that are involved. At the end of that training program, once again, I went through a competency testing phase. It was comprised of the same 4 components, and I successfully completed all 4 components, and therefore am also able to perform independent analysis in the area of direct-to-DNA analysis.
I need you to speak into the mic a little better for my benefit, if not for the jurors' benefit.
Okay, so, and Agent Nguyen, have you testified in court before?
I have.
And how many times have you testified in court? Just
This
an
will be,
estimate.
oh, sorry. This will be my 19th time.
And have you been qualified as an expert when you've testified in prior proceedings?
I have been qualified as an expert.
As an expert in forensic serology?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to qualify Agent Nguyen as an expert in forensic serology.
No objection.
She is admitted as an expert in the field of forensic serology.
Okay, Agent Nguyen, you were working in the serology department back in June of 2021?
I was.
Okay. And did you examine some items from evidence in the investigation of the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh?
I did.
I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 63 through 66. I'll have you take a look at these items for us. Are those items that you examined?
Yes, they are. I can identify these items because on the small manila envelopes contained within, I have written the unique case number that was assigned to this case at SLED, as well as each of their item numbers, my initials, and the date I opened the packaging.
Okay, and each of those items is a 300 blackout case.
Yes.
Okay, now what did you do with those items?
So when cartridge casings are submitted for touch DNA, which is what these were submitted for, we process them with a soaking method. So each cartridge case is placed within a tube, submerged within a solution, lightly shaken, and then it has to sit for at least 30 minutes. Once that 30 minutes is up, each individual cartridge case will then be removed from its tube. The solution will be poured into a filtration unit. The cartridge case will be dried. It will be labeled with the individual item number and then placed on a rack to further dry thoroughly. The solution that is placed within this filtration unit, the filtration unit looks like an hourglass. So there's a chamber on the top and a chamber on the bottom, and it's separated by a filter. So the liquid that is being poured in the top chamber will filter through the center, which has a filter which we call an MBAC collection. The goal is that if there's any DNA present within these cartridge casings, it will be trapped within the filter. And then the water goes to the bottom. The solution. And then the filter is set out to dry for at least 24 hours. Once the filter is dried, it is then cut, prepared for analysis. So it is cut in half, placed in a tube, labeled with the case number, the item number, and then it is forwarded for further analysis. And that collection from these items was identified as SLED item 7.1.
You, State's Exhibit 459, you could tell us, is that what you collected from those cases there?
Yes, so within here is, as I mentioned, SLED item 7.1. Once again, I recognize this because it has the unique case number, the container number, my name and date on the outside, as well as my name and date on a seal at the top.
And what did you say you did when you collected the, I guess, disc, would you say?
So once the MVAC collection or the filter is dried, I will cut it in half and then half again. So each water will be placed within a tube for DNA analysis. It's labeled with the unique case number, the item number, and it is forwarded for further analysis.
So you forwarded that to DNA for more analysis?
That is correct.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move 459 into evidence.
Submitted.
All right. I'm going to show you tapes 33 and 34, which are fired shot shells. Did you perform any kind of testing on those two items?
Yes, so states 33 and states 34 are consistent with SLED item number 9 and 10, which were fired shot shells. These were also submitted to the laboratory for touch processing. These shot shells were swabbed for the touch collection. So basically I take 2 swabs, sterile swabs, and moisten one with the ionized water, and then I will rub it against the exterior of both of them and then leave them out to dry. Once the swabs are dried, I will then prepare them for DNA analysis, which involves just cutting a small portion from each swab, placing it within a tube, labeling it with the case number, the item number, and forwarding it for further analysis. For this, these swabs from the entire exterior of these 2 items were identified as item 10.1.
And I believe item 10.1 is also in State's Exhibit 459, which has been admitted. And you can open that if you need to.
Yes, this also contains item 10.1.
Which are the swabs from these shot shells here.
That is correct.
And then what did you do with those swabs once they were collected?
So they were prepared for DNA analysis and forwarded to the DNA section for further analysis.
I'm going to hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 18, which I believe is your item 17.
Yes, so I recognize this from the same process. I have the unique case number, the item number, my initials, and the date I opened. Item 17, which is State's Exhibit 18. I also have my initials and date from when I sealed this pouch.
And now what is that item?
SLED's item 17 are swabs collected from exterior doorknob of storage room door.
And what did you do with that item?
So I prepared these swabs for DNA analysis. Once again, I just cut a small portion from the swabs and forwarded it for further analysis.
State's 259.
States 259 I do recognize for the same reason. I have written the case number, the item numbers, my initials, and the date that I opened these items. Found within States 259 are items 15 and 16. Item 15 are swabs from Camo Benelli 12-gauge shotgun receiver forward of the loading port, and swabs identified as item 16 are swabs collected from barrel of Camo Benelli 12-gauge shotgun.
Now, did you do any testing of those swabs?
Yes. Items 15 and 16 had blood requests on them, so these were tested with our presumptive blood test. A presumptive test only indicates the possible presence of a body fluid, and how I did that is because since these are swabs, I took a sterile swab, moistened it with deionized water, then rubbed it gently upon the swabs that are identified as these items. I then tested that test swab for the possible presence of blood. Closer.
This is a personal conversation.
I'm sorry.
You know, the prosecutor is behind you, and you're looking at her, and the mic is in front of you, and Attorney General, if you would move in a different direction, the witness will speak in a different direction, and I can understand what she's saying, or she can speak louder, or speak into the mic rather than speaking to you.
Okay, so if you could, please continue explaining what the item is, please.
Yes, so I tested these presumptively for the presence of blood. So item 15, which were the swabs from the receiver forward of the loading port of the Camo Benelli 12-gauge shotgun, tested positive for the possible presence of blood. Item 16, swabs collected from barrel of Camo Benelli 12-gauge shotgun, tested negative for the possible presence of blood. Both sets of swabs were forwarded to the DNA section for further analysis.
Okay, so at this point, we don't know, we just know there's blood.
There's the possible presence of blood on item 15.
Objecting to the leading question.
Pardon?
Objecting to the leading question, Your Honor.
All right. Please do not lead the witness and restate the question.
And what did you say was present or presumptively present on those items?
So item 15 was positive for the possible presence of blood. Item 16 was negative for the possible presence of blood.
And what did you do after you made those determinations?
So both of these sets of swabs were prepared for DNA analysis and forwarded to the DNA section for further testing.
I'm going to hand you State's Exhibit 398. If you will take a look at those two items and tell the jury what those are.
State's Exhibit 398 are SLED items 22.4 and 22.5, which corresponds to item 22.5 is described as reddish-brown debris swabbed from the right side of item 22 receiver, and 22.5 is described as reddish-brown debris swabbed from the left side of the item 22 receiver above manufacturer information.
And what did you do with those items?
These items also had a blood request. So the same process as the previous items I just mentioned. I took a sterile swab, moistened it with deionized water, swabbed these swabs, and then with that test swab is what I tested for the presumptive blood test.
Could you please explain any results?
So both items 22.4 and 22.5 tested positive for the possible presence of blood.
And then what did you do with those items once you did the blood test?
These two sets of swabs were then prepared for DNA analysis and forwarded to the DNA section for further testing.
Now, there was a number of guns in this case that were processed. Is that right?
I believe so.
Okay. Could you tell us about the testing you did on State's Exhibit 89, your item 30, the Mossberg shotgun?
So when items of evidence are submitted to the SLED laboratory, sometimes they have multiple requests of different departments. In this case, item 30, a Mossberg shotgun, had 3 requests for the latent prints department, for the DNA department, as well as the firearms department. So we try to organize it so that no department's analysis conflicts with another department. In this case, this item was forwarded or was sent to the latent prints department for processing. The latent prints examiners are trained in collection for touch DNA as well as swabbing up any stains that they may notice. So item 30 had a blood request on it. The latent prints examiner, which took this item into their custody, requested that I come down as a second pair of eyes to visually examine this item for any possible staining. We located one stain, which I tested for the possible presence of blood, and the result was negative.
And after that, are you aware of any further processing on that Mossberg shotgun?
I am not. So I was there with the examiner, and it remained within that examiner's custody the entire time.
All right, let's move on to the other shotguns. We have a Browning shotgun, a Benelli Black Eagle 2, 12-gauge shotgun, and the rifle, in addition to the guns we've already talked about. Can you kind of sum up how you analyzed those three different guns?
So those three different guns that you just mentioned were items 31, 32, and 33. They were done in the same manner as item 30, as I just mentioned. So they were within the custody of the latent prints examiner. I went down to visualize it for any possible staining. The result for these three guns, however, was no apparent blood stains present.
And did you do anything else to check for blood at that point?
I did nothing further with these items.
I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 83. If you could take a look and tell us what items are contained in Exhibit 83.
May I open this?
Yes.
State's Exhibit 83 contains sled items 51
And Agent Nguyen, you don't have to go through the sled item numbers.
through
Thank
60.
you. Yeah. And those items are what, though?
They are all swabs that were taken from the Chevy Suburban.
And can you tell us what kind of testing was done on those swabs?
So it appears that these swabs were collected because they were Blue Star positive, which to my understanding is a presumptive test used by the crime scene unit to indicate areas of possible blood staining. Since they were already presumptively tested, I used a confirmatory test to test these swabs for the presence of blood. So sled items 51 through 55 and 57 through 60 were all negative with that testing, which means there is no human blood identified. Item 56, which was swabs collected from steering wheel, had a positive result, which means blood was identified on this item.
And what kind of testing did you do to confirm that blood?
I used a confirmatory test called Hemotrace.
And how does Hemotrace work?
So Hemotrace is a card test. It's similar to a pregnancy test or more relevant, a COVID test. You take a sample from the item of evidence, place it in a solution, and it should sit there for a while. And then once it has mixed in with the solution will then be placed on this card test, and then a result will be revealed. Results are read after 10 minutes.
Okay. And what are the potential results from that test? Just in general, from Hemotrace testing.
There's a positive result or a negative result.
Okay. And in this case, what was the result on the steering wheel swab?
On the steering wheel swab, it was positive, which is a result of blood identified.
And then what did you do with that swab once you completed your testing?
So item 56 was then prepared for DNA analysis and forwarded to the DNA section for further analysis.
Okay, I'm going to next show you items, or state's exhibit, 251 and 252. Those are marked for identification only. Okay, can you tell us what are those items?
So State's Exhibit 251 corresponds to the left fingernail clippings and right fingernail clippings of Margaret Murdaugh. State's Exhibit 252 corresponds to the left fingernail clippings and right fingernail clippings of Paul Murdaugh.
Okay. So on State's 251, the fingernail clippings from Margaret Murdaugh, what, if anything, did you do to those items?
So State's Exhibit 251, what's received is clipping from her fingernails. So I will take a portion of the clippings that have been submitted, place it within a tube, and forward it to the DNA section for further analysis.
Okay, when you say a portion of the clippings, does that mean you clip some more and send to DNA, or what does that mean?
So the literal fingernail clippings are what's being submitted within the envelope. So say there's 5 clippings. I will forward approximately 2 to 3 of what's been submitted, place it within the tube, and that's what will be forwarded for analysis.
And did you do the same process with State's Exhibit 252, the fingernail clippings from Paul Murdaugh?
Yes, State's Exhibit 252 will receive the same preparation for DNA analysis.
Your Honor, this time the state would move Exhibits 251 and 252 into evidence.
No objection.
They're admitted.
All right, Agent Nguyen, next if you could tell us a little about State's Exhibit 418, which was Alex Murdaugh's shirt. Could you describe how you first processed the shirt when it was initially received by the lab?
So the white shirt from Richard Murdaugh was submitted with a blood request. On June 9th of 2021, I processed this item for the possible presence of blood. So that entails I first visually examined the shirt for any areas that are consistent with the staining of blood. Then I tested these items that I have indicated with our phenolphthalein presumptive test for blood. 2 stains were indicated or were tested. Both stains were positive for the possible presence of blood. 1 stain located at the exterior front bottom edge of white shirt was forwarded to the DNA section for further analysis. Afterward,
Just a second.
okay.
And I'm going to hand you State's 460. Now, you just said that stain was processed and sent to DNA. How did you process that? Did you send the whole shirt, or how did that work?
So the stain that I had located, I cut that stain from the shirt. I then prepared it for DNA analysis, which means I cut a small portion of that stain, placed it within the tube, labeled that tube, and forwarded the cutting as well as the portion that I have prepared to the DNA section for further analysis.
And that cutting is contained in State's 460, is that correct?
That cutting is contained in States 460.
And what date did you perform that initial analysis?
On June 9th of 2021.
And I think you mentioned there was another stain also located on the shirt at that time?
Yes, 2 stains were presumptively tested.
Was that second stain cut on June the 8th?
It was not. It remained in the shirt and was identified with the presumptive test result.
Now, due to ongoing investigation, did you come back and examine that shirt again?
Yes, so afterwards, a request was relayed to me to go back to the shirt and retrieve that stain and forward it for DNA analysis.
Did you do any other testing this second time around?
So when I went to remove that second stain, I met with members of the crime scene unit, Lieutenant Wallace, as well as Special Agent Worley, and they processed the shirt with their LCV testing, which to my understanding is their presumptive test for blood.
And what was discovered during the LCV testing?
So after removing the second stain from the June 9th date that I processed it, 10 additional stains were identified from the LCV processing, which were cut from the shirt and prepared for DNA analysis and forwarded for further testing.
And I will show you page 461. Are those the additional cuttings from the shirt? And there are quite a few cuttings here.
Yes, so all the cuttings from the shirt are here.
Okay. Now, as far as you're concerned, did you process the shirt any further?
No, besides preparing these additional stains that were identified, nothing further was done.
And what did you do with those cuttings?
I cut a small portion from each of the stains that was indicated as being positive and forwarded it to the DNA section for further analysis.
All right, and State's Exhibit 418 is the defendant's shorts. How were those shorts processed in comparison to the shirt?
So the shorts also were submitted with a blood request. They were processed in a similar manner. Several stains were tested, however, 2 were positive for the possible presence of blood. A stain located at the front left interior pocket of the pair of green shorts was forwarded for further analysis. This was processed on the same June 9th date of 2021. The shorts were also additionally processed at the same time the shirt was additionally processed to retrieve a second stain that was indicated as the possible presence of blood. And then the same members of the crime scene unit also processed the shirt with their LCV testing.
And I believe we still have Exhibit 460 up there. Does that contain the first cutting from the pair of pants on June 8th?
Yes, State's Exhibit 460 contains the first cutting from the pair of shorts from June 8th, or 9th, I'm sorry.
And then State's Exhibit 461, what cutting, that contains cutting from the pants on July 21st, is that right?
Yes, so State's Exhibit 461 does contain the additional cuttings, so the second stain that had tested positive on the June 9th processing date, as well as 6 additional stains were indicated from the crime scene unit when they processed the pair of shorts with their LCV testing.
And then what did you do with those cuttings once you took them?
The cuttings for the shorts were prepared for DNA analysis, once again, cutting a small portion of the stain and forwarding it for further analysis.
And I'm going to show you page 473. You could take a look at that. Do you recognize that as, what do you recognize that as?
So this appears to be a photo of item 20.2, which is the cutting from front left interior pocket of pair of green shorts from Richard Murdaugh.
Your Honor, this time I would move States 473 into evidence.
No objection.
Submitted.
Motion to publish.
Yes.
Okay, and Agent Nguyen, if you could describe to the jurors what they're looking at in that picture.
So this is the stain that was tested, and as you can see, I have labeled it with the SLED item number, both on the physical item as well as it's contained within a manila envelope, which has the unique case number, item number, the request was for blood, the location it was taken from, as well as that it's a cutting. In addition, you can see my initials and date from when I prepared this for DNA analysis.
Okay, and again, I'm sorry, what were the presumptive results of the testing for blood?
So the presumptive results for this stain were that it was positive for the possible presence of blood.
And we talked a little bit about the cuttings of the shirt and the shorts. Just to kind of aid the jury in seeing what you actually did, I'm going to show you states 471 and 472. Do you recognize those pictures?
I do recognize these pictures. They are from the additional processing that occurred on the shirt.
Your Honor, at this time, this tape would move 471 and 472 in evidence.
No objection.
They are admitted.
On states 472, could you just kind of describe to the jurors what they're looking at here and point their attention to the areas in the shirt that you cut? If you can see.
So if you look in the square labeled E7, there is a stain that's circled. It has the item number 19.3 as well as a plus phene. That was the second stain that I had tested on the original processing date that was to be retrieved during this time of processing. Then you can see there are additional stains circled in blue with letter identifiers. Those were areas of staining that was identified from the crime scene unit when they processed with their LCV test. Each stain has the sub-item twice. That is to, one is to stay with the stain once I've cut it, and then one is to stay within the shirt, so in the event that you needed to know where that stain had originated, you could locate it.
And then State's Exhibit 471.
State's Exhibit 471 is the front of the shirt. It has several areas of staining that were circled as a result of the LCV processing by the crime scene unit.
And those are also areas that you cut from the shirt.
Yes, so once again, I have written the sub-item numbers that they were assigned, and then removed each of these stainings along the line that I've outlined, and prepared these stains for further analysis for DNA.
And you said you followed the same process regarding the pants.
That is correct.
All right, let's move on to State's Exhibit 419, which was the shoes of the defendant. Can you tell us what you did with those shoes?
So the shoes, which are described as a pair of red, yellow, and white tennis shoes from Richard Murdaugh, they had the same blood request, so I visually examined the shoes for any areas of possible blood staining and then tested those stainings. 2 were indicated as being possibly positive for the possible presence of blood. One stain was forwarded for DNA analysis, and it was located on the left shoelace of the pair of red, yellow, and white tennis shoes.
And are those cuttings in State's Exhibit 460 that you already have up there with you?
Yes, the cutting from the shoes is contained within State's Exhibit 460.
Your Honor, at this time, the State would move States 460 and 461 into evidence.
No objection.
You're admitted.
All right, Agent Nguyen, we're making some good progress here. State's Exhibit 226 was a blue raincoat. Can you explain to the jurors what you did to process that item?
So the blue raincoat also had 2 types of processing. During the first time of processing, which occurred on October 7th of 2021, the raincoat was processed for the possible presence of blood. This was done by myself, as well as members of the crime scene unit, Lieutenant Wallace, as well as Special Agent Moore. I first performed presumptive testing with our blood tests, and then the crime scene unit went behind and then processed with the raincoat with their LCB testing. I tested 71 stains. All 71 stains were negative for the possible presence of blood. After that, the LCV processing took place. No areas of interest were indicated, as interpreted by the crime scene unit as being positive, and therefore, on October 7th of 2021, nothing was forwarded for DNA analysis.
And why was nothing forwarded? Just simply?
There were no stains that indicated the possible presence of blood.
All right. Then did you go back and re-examine the raincoat?
Yes, an additional request came in for the raincoat for ownership. Once again, ownership is a collection method for DNA to identify the primary wearer of an item.
Okay. And how did you process that for ownership?
2 sets of swabs were taken off the raincoat. The first set of swabs was identified as item 173.2, which were swabs from interior cuffs, collar, and hood, interior and exterior zipper area, zipper and zipper pull of the blue raincoat. The second set of swabs that were taken from the raincoat were identified as item 173.3, swabs from side openings, zipper area, and both interior portions of exterior pocket of the blue raincoat. In addition,
Excuse me. I'll hand you States 462. And what are those? Are those the swabs you were just telling us about?
States Exhibit 462 are both sets of swabs that I just recently spoke about from collecting from the raincoat.
Okay. And what did you do with those swabs?
These swabs were prepared for DNA analysis and forwarded to the DNA section for further analysis.
This time the state would move to admit States Exhibit 462.
No objection.
Yeah, it's admitted.
And Agent Nguyen, when you were examining the raincoat for ownership, did you find anything on that raincoat to help with that analysis, such as hair or anything like that?
So part of the ownership processing is to look for hair. The raincoat, there was no hair found.
Did you also notice anything about the condition of the raincoat?
Yes, so on my evidence worksheet, which is where we document the items that we perform processing on, as well as the respective results, I also document any describing factors. So on this worksheet, in regards to the blue raincoat, I do have that the plastic seam liner was coming off throughout the item.
What did you say?
I called it a plastic seam liner.
Was coming off? I can't hear you.
Coming off throughout the item.
Thank you. All right. Also, in this case, did you receive a number of buccal swabs?
I did.
And that is, what did you do with those buccal swabs when you received them?
So buccal swabs don't require any testing on my part. I just prepare those buccal swabs for DNA analysis. Once again, cutting a small portion off of each swab, placing it within a tube, and forwarding it for further analysis.
All right, Agent Nguyen, the state has no further questions at this time. If you'll please answer any questions from the defense.
Mr. Barber.
Good morning, excuse me, good morning, Agent Nguyen.
Good morning.
Is it agent, am I right? Very briefly, At the outset, you discussed collecting for DNA testing for the blackout cartridges. Is that correct?
Collecting for the possible presence of touch DNA, yes.
Yes. And did you only test 2 of those cartridges?
All 7 were processed using the soaking method.
Okay. With that processing method, any results that you will receive, would they be specific to any one cartridge, or would it just be for the collection of all 7?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Would you have results for DNA from the way that you collected the sample for a specific shell case, or would it be for all 7 as a set?
Okay, I just want to clarify, I did say there were 7 cartridges, there were only 6. So although they are being individually soaked, they are being combined within that filtration unit, so the results would be from all of the cartridges together.
And you had positive presumptive tests for 2 shotguns, correct? Portions of 2 shotguns?
Do you have a item number that corresponds?
I can get those in a second. Do you remember there are 2 shotguns you just testified had positive presumptive blood tests? One was sled item number 15.
Yes, so the swabs from the Benelli shotgun, item 15, was positive for the possible presence of blood. However, I believe you mean the second set of swabs, item 16, that was negative.
And then there was later sled item 22.
Oh yes, the 2 sets of swabs from sled item 22 were both positive for the possible presence of blood.
So I guess, what exactly is a presumptive test?
So a presumptive test is indicating the possible presence of a body fluid, in this case, blood. It's not confirming the presence, it's just an indication so that we can further test that stain.
And how does it indicate the possible presence of blood?
So the phenolphthalein test interacts with the hemoglobin found within blood, and that's what it's basically giving a positive result with.
Is it fair to say that it changes color? It's like a dye and it changes color?
So it's a color change test. Based on the presence of the hemoglobin, a swab that's being tested will turn a bright pink color.
And is that presumptive test specific to human blood?
It is not specifically human blood. It can be human blood or animal blood.
Could chemicals other than blood cause a positive test result?
So the phenolphthalein test has what we call false positives, which can give a positive result, but it is not blood. Those include copper salts, nickel salts, rust, as well as some plant and peroxidases, which include broccoli, cauliflower, horseradish. It also can give a positive result for pus and sometimes in the presence of bacteria.
Okay, so there are a number of things that could give a positive result. Is that why you also have a confirmatory test?
If we test something for the possible presence of blood, we don't typically do a confirmatory test unless it's requested. We just store that sample for DNA analysis.
Who would request a confirmatory test?
Usually an investigator of an agency may request it. Sometimes solicitors or defense attorneys may request an additional test.
And the confirmatory test, I think you testified, is just basically like a COVID test?
It works similar to a COVID test.
2 lines means human blood?
It'll have a line to indicate that the test is working properly, which is a control line. And then if it is positive, it will have an additional second line. If that second line does not show, that means that the test is negative.
Is it an accurate test?
I would say that it's an accurate test as long as the control line is present.
It's more accurate than the presumptive test. That's why you use it, correct?
So the confirmatory test is saying that, yes, blood is identified on the item that's being tested.
Human blood.
Human blood, as well as higher primate blood and ferret blood.
And you did not do any confirmatory tests on the shotguns?
I did not do any confirmatory tests on the shotgun swabs.
And that was simply because no one asked you to, correct?
In effort to not consume any of the sample on the swabs, as a swab is a small area, we just forward it for DNA analysis.
But in the Chevy Suburban, you did perform a hemotrace test?
Yes, because that these swabs for the Chevy Suburban were already previously processed with another presumptive test by the crime scene unit, we could not presumptive test behind because our two tests work in a similar manner.
Whose decision was it to do the hemotrace test on the Chevy Suburban?
That is typically how we process items of evidence that we receive from the crime scene unit in the form of swabs based on any of their presumptive testing.
But like, who made the decision to do the hemotrace test on that steering wheel? The name of a person?
I perform the hemotrace test.
On your own initiative?
No, that is a common way we do testing on swabs that have already been collected based on a presumptive test.
Did someone instruct you to perform a hemotrace test on the steering wheel?
No, it is part of our general operating procedures.
But you did not perform hemotrace tests on the weapons?
The swabs that were collected off of the weapons, no, because they were not presumptively testing prior, so I could use our presumptive test on those items.
Did you perform or prepare any samples from the victim's clothing or bodies other than the fingernail clippings that you discussed?
I do not believe so.
Okay, so the only thing from the body of Maggie Murdaugh or Paul Murdaugh that you tested were the fingernail clippings from Maggie Murdaugh?
So I prepared the fingernail clippings for DNA analysis, as well as the buccal swabs from those individuals.
Right. But nothing else from their bodies, correct?
No, I did not test their clothing.
Or their clothing, sorry.
I did not test their clothing.
When looking at the T-shirt that you just testified about, and those cuttings, I think you have opened a bag and the cuttings were there and you prepared them. Did you perform any serology tests on those cuttings?
No, I just removed those cuttings from the shirt as the result of the crime scene testing.
Are you aware of any serology tests being performed on those cuttings?
Of the shirt?
Yes, of those big shirt cuttings.
I believe there was further analysis performed on those cuttings.
Did somebody other than you later perform serology tests on those cuttings, to your knowledge?
It is my understanding that there was additional testing on those cuttings.
Serology testing?
Serology testing.
Specifically hemotrace?
I believe there was hemotrace performed on the cuttings from the shirt.
But that, just to be clear, that wasn't performed by you?
I did not perform hemotrace on any of the cuttings on the shirt.
Did you perform any hemotrace tests on the shorts or tennis shoes?
I did not perform any hemotrace testing on the shorts or the shoes.
Just, I guess, maybe a little bit of background to understand maybe who does what. When you're working on this case, do you have like a direct supervisor?
I do have a direct supervisor.
And who is that person?
Her name is Laura Hash.
And is she the person who directs your activities as regard to this case?
Objection, Your Honor, relevance.
Objections overruled.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Is Lieutenant Laura Hash the person who would direct your activities with regards to this case?
So, based on our operating manual, as well as my training experience, based on the requests of certain items that are submitted, I will decide how those are tested. However, if additional processing is requested, those usually are communicated to me through my direct supervisor.
And just for clarity, we've talked a bit about DNA, but you're just preparing samples and they go to someone else who does the analysis and reports. That's not you, correct?
That's correct. I am just preparing the samples for further analysis.
Is the only hemotrace test that you did for this case the steering wheel? Well, strike that. The Chevy Suburban, I believe there may have been some negative tests from the Suburban, but were those the only hemotrace tests you did for this case?
No, I did hemotrace the swabs from the Chevy Suburban. I also hemotrace tested swabs collected from a Ford F-250.
And what were the results from the Ford F-250?
There were 4 swabs submitted from the Ford F-250, and the results for all 4 of those sets of swabs were negative for human blood.
So the steering wheel was the only positive test that you did for hemotrace?
Yes, the steering wheel from the Chevy Suburban is the only positive hemotrace result I have.
Beg the court's indulgence. Just maybe one final question or a little set of questions. It seems like sometimes the crime scene people or department, I shouldn't just say people, I guess they're a department, do presumptive blood tests. Is that correct?
Yes, it's my understanding that the crime scene unit does perform presumptive blood tests.
And the initials LCV have been used. I think you might have mentioned. What does that mean?
It stands for leucocrystalline violet.
And can you describe that test?
I don't know much about the test. I just know that it is a test that the crime scene unit uses as their presumptive blood test.
Do you know what color it turns when there's a positive result?
It'll turn a purple color.
So I think let me ask this. Why, we saw a picture of the shirt gridded out. You remember that exhibit?
I do.
Why was the presumptive test done? It was at the Slab Laboratory? Is that the location that was?
Are you asking about the LCV processing?
Yes, where was that test conducted?
That was done at the Sled Laboratory.
Why was that done by the crime scene unit and not the serology unit?
We do not use LCV testing, and I am unsure as to why that particular test was chosen to be used by the crime scene unit.
Because earlier, you did tests on the hem, right? The pheno tests on the front and back hem of the shirt, is that correct?
I did.
But then the crime scene unit later came back and in the lab did a different kind of test.
That is correct.
And you don't know why?
I was not part of that decision. I was just notified that they would be performing that test while I was retrieving the additional stain that I had tested earlier.
And finally, it seems like if something is tested presumptive in the field and comes to you, you do a confirmatory test. Is that what happened with the Chevy Suburban?
Yes, that's correct.
But if something comes to you and there's not been a presumptive test, like with the shotguns, then you don't perform a confirmatory test?
No, I do the presumptive test.
Do you know why that's the policy?
It's an effort to not consume as much sample on a swab. A swab is it's like a sterile Q-tip, so essentially the surface area is very small. So in efforts to not consume the sample and to give more for DNA analysis, that's what's done.
If something goes to DNA analysis and there's some result, does it ever come back for a blood test to see if the source of the DNA was blood?
To be phen tested?
No, for hemotrace test.
As I mentioned, hemotrace testing can be requested on the back end, as any of our CAR tests can be.
In your experience, I think we had some testimony about your experience. If DNA is found on something, is there ever then a time that you go back and say, hey, was the source of this DNA blood, and do a hemotrace test?
Hemotrace specifically, to my knowledge, no. But in my experience, there have been times that solicitors or defense attorneys will request a card test be done on a sample after the DNA analysis has been performed.
Any redirect?
None from the state, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down. We'll be in recess for about 10 minutes or so.
Be seated.
If you bring the jury. Thank you. Your next witness.
This case calls Sarah Zapata.
Adjust the mic so we can hear you. Ma'am, speak your name again for the record, spell your last name.
Sarah Zapata, Z-A-P-A-T-A.
Okay. Agent Zapata, I think we have a, I guess, what would you call that? A container of, is that your notes up there?
Yes, my case file and other relevant documents.
Okay, to aid you in your testimony if necessary.
Yes.
Could you tell the jurors where you work?
I work for the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, commonly known as SLED,
And how long have you worked for SLED?
for about 7.5 years.
What is your job title there?
I am a forensic scientist in the DNA casework department.
What are some of your duties as a forensic scientist in DNA?
As a DNA analyst, I will look at the requests for different items of evidence. I can perform serology testing if necessary or refer to the serologist results. I will take the items of evidence as well as any known standards through our standard laboratory procedures to develop a DNA profile. The steps of that analysis are extraction, which is where we are trying to isolate any DNA present on that evidence item from the evidence item itself, as
And
well as
Agent, if you could pull the microphone to speak up a little bit.
Sure,
Thank
sorry.
you.
As well as from any other cellular material present. The second step is quantitation, where we're trying to approximate how much DNA is present on that sample so that we can target the appropriate amount of DNA for the next step, which is amplification. Amplification works kind of like a chemical copy machine. We're targeting specific areas of the DNA that have been shown through scientific studies to vary from person to person. And we're trying to make copies of that so that it can be detected by our final instrument, which is what actually separates the DNA into a profile. And then I will interpret that profile and calculate any statistics and prepare a report. I can also perform technical and administrative reviews of other analysts' work, as well as testify in court when necessary.
Okay. And can you tell us a little about your educational background and training that qualify you for this position?
I have a Bachelor of Science in Forensic Science from the Pennsylvania State University. Upon employment at SLED, I underwent a training program for approximately a year and a half under a qualified DNA analyst, and that training included an observation period as well as a practical period of the different steps in our DNA analysis process, as well as the serology procedures. Once I had received all of my training, I went through a testing period where I had to demonstrate my competency in using all those different instruments and procedures and interpretation. I had to successfully complete several written exams, an oral exam, complete several mock cases and a mock court, and then was competency tested with another case before finally being able to do a mock case, before finally being able to do analysis on real casework.
You will need to speak into the mic and increase your volume in order for us to hear you better.
Okay.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Agent Zapata, how many cases have you, do you think you've participated in?
Approximately 500.
And have you testified in trial before?
Yes, I have.
How many times?
19.
And in those trials, were you qualified as an expert witness?
Yes, I was.
In what were you qualified as an expert witness in?
In DNA analysis.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to qualify Agent Zapata as an expert in DNA analysis. All right, you had mentioned in some of the duties of your job, kind of what you do. I guess if we could kind of scale it back a little bit more basic, but briefly, just what is DNA?
DNA is a chemical that is found throughout your body with the exception of red blood cells. You get half of your DNA from your mom and half from your dad, and it's unique to individuals with the exception of identical twins.
And so if we have a case where there are family members involved, what does that mean as far as DNA analysis?
Based upon the evidence DNA profile, sometimes it might not be possible to make comparisons to some family members because there may not be enough DNA present there to distinguish between the family members. Because the family members will share DNA, that will affect what the DNA profile looks like.
Can you tell us about some different sources of DNA from a person's body?
Some sources from your body would be your hair, blood, semen, saliva, bones, as well as DNA from your skin cells, which is what we call touch DNA.
And what are some variables that can affect touch DNA?
So some people just naturally shed more skin cells throughout the day than other people, and so you would expect to recover more DNA from an object that a person who sheds a lot of DNA has handled than a person who sheds less. There are also factors such as the surface that is being touched. If the surface is rough, then you would leave more skin cells behind. If you are holding the item for a longer period of time or with a lot of pressure, then you would expect to leave more skin cells behind. Environmental factors such as rain, moisture, UV, light, that can all lessen the amount of DNA that is recovered. And also personal hygiene habits can affect how much DNA you leave behind. So if you've just washed your hands, there may not be as much skin cells left behind.
So do you leave touch DNA behind kind of like you would leave a fingerprint behind? Is that a fair comparison?
Kind of. If you touch it, you touch an object, you may leave some behind.
All right, now you mentioned different sources such as body fluids. Are you able to confirm like 100% which body fluid a DNA profile comes from?
So the test that we perform to try to identify a body fluid is different from the DNA testing that is being performed. especially in cases where the evidence profile is a mixture. There's no way for us to tell, did all of this DNA come from blood? Did it come from saliva and blood mixed together? There's no way for us to identify 100% the source of the DNA profile. We can indicate that a body fluid may be present, but we cannot say the blood on this item is from this individual.
So if I had a drop of blood on my shirt up here, could you ever say this was my blood?
I could test it for the indication of a body fluid. I could see if your DNA profile is recovered from that stain, if the evidentiary DNA profile, if you are included as a contributor to that profile, but I can never 100% say that is your blood.
So you could say my DNA is here, but not my blood.
I could say that you're included as a contributor to the DNA profile.
Okay. All right, and I think you kind of already explained your process of DNA analysis when you explained your duties. Can you tell us about some of the, standard lab procedures and protocol?
How specifically do you mean?
I guess just basically how you analyze a DNA sample.
So I will take the DNA sample if it has been previously cut by a serologist or an evidence processor. I will add the reagents to the tube and proceed with my analysis that way. If it has not previously been cut, then I can prepare the sample for DNA and then take it through those steps that I explained earlier, so extraction, quantitation, amplification, and separation into a profile. And then I will interpret the DNA profile that was developed. So I will determine if there is enough DNA present there for the profile to be used for comparison. I will determine the number of contributors to that profile. So a profile can be single source, which is DNA from just one individual, or a mixture, DNA from multiple individuals are present in the profile. I'll determine if it's a mixture, how many people are in that mixture, or how many I'm interpreting that mixture as. And then I can calculate statistics to compare.
So first of all, let me stop you for a minute.
Sorry.
But these determinations, how are you making the determinations?
So I'm looking at the DNA profile and using our protocol, our procedures, my training and experience as a DNA analyst to determine the number of contributors to the profile.
And how are you looking at it? Are you visually looking at it, or is a computer program looking at it, or what's going on there?
So I visually examine the profile myself as the analyst. I determine the number of contributors to the profile, and then we also use a software program called StarMix to help in our interpretation. And what StarMix does is look at the evidence profile and attempt to break it down into the potential contributors to that profile. So if you think about the evidence profile as like grandma's chocolate chip cookies, you know exactly what that cookie is supposed to taste like. You know what the final product is supposed to be, and you're trying to recreate that recipe and get it as close to grandma's cookie as what you know it's supposed to be. So you're testing different ingredients at different proportions to see what can make up that cookie. And that is kind of what StarMix does when it's looking at the profile. And then I will evaluate the StarMix output, make sure that what StarMix is telling me makes sense based upon what the profile looks like. And then if everything worked properly, I can use StarMix also to calculate our statistics.
Okay, and how do you calculate that statistic?
So the statistic that StarMix calculates is called a likelihood ratio. It's a comparison of two possible scenarios to see which is a better explanation of the DNA profile that was developed. It works kind of like a seesaw. So if you have one scenario on one side and another scenario on the other side, and StarMix is going to put more weight on the scenario that is a better explanation of the DNA profile. You do these kinds of comparisons subconsciously in your mind all day long. If the DNA profile, for example, is the the fact that someone ran a marathon. That's your result. The two scenarios that could explain that result are, one, the person trained every day for months leading up to the marathon. They ran many, many miles. The second scenario is that they sat on the couch and watched TV and never ran at all. Which one is a more likely explanation of the fact that they finished the marathon? It would be the first one, that they trained really hard. And so that is the kind of comparison that StarMix is making.
And where do these scenarios come from, I guess?
So based upon what the DNA profile looks like, we will set up the two opposing scenarios to make the comparison. And the first scenario is always going to include the person whose standard is being compared to that profile, so the person whose statistic you are calculating. And the second scenario is always going to include an unidentified, unrelated individual, because you need something that opposes that comparison. So for a single source profile, your two scenarios will be the person being compared is contributing to the mixture versus an unidentified, unrelated individual is contributing to the mixture. To the profile for a single source. If it is a mixture, then you need to account for the other potential individuals present in that profile. So for a two-person mixture, for example, the first scenario will be the person being compared and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture versus two unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And so we'll make that same comparison for each person based upon what the DNA profile looks like.
Okay. And so this unidentified, unrelated individual, where does that really come from?
That's just the way that the statistic is calculated. It's not saying that it's not possible for related individuals to be in the mixture, but because we are focusing only on the comparison to that one person, we need something to contrast that to, and we account for that by using that unidentified, unrelated individual wording.
So is that just kind of built into this formula in the StarMix program?
Correct.
All right. So what are some results that you can obtain from your comparisons you make?
So a result in support of the first scenario, which is that the person being compared to the profile is contributing to the profile, the seesaw will tilt in that direction, and we call that an inclusion. If it is tilting far enough in the other direction, we call that an exclusion. It's saying that the person being compared is not a contributor to the profile under those two scenarios that are being compared. It's possible for the seesaw to just tilt a little bit in either direction if the DNA in the profile is very low level or very partial. There's just not that much information there to make the comparison, and so it's not tilting in one way or the other very strongly. It is also possible, if it's very partial, very low level information, for the seesaw to just not move at all. It's saying that neither explanation is a better explanation for the DNA profile, and we'll call that uninformative.
Okay. And do you set up propositions the same way for each comparison to an item?
Yes, so first we will say if the item is suitable for comparison, then we will say the number of contributors that we're interpreting that profile as, and then we will set up those two scenarios each time. In the cases of items that are being taken off of someone's body or swabs from their body, we'll call that an intimate item. And so we want to account for the presence of the individual whose body the item was taken off of in that profile. Because it's being removed from their body, we're expecting that profile to be there. And so we can do that in two ways. We'll look at the DNA profile. If their DNA is clearly present in the profile, we will assume them as a contributor. And what that does is put that person on both sides of the seesaw. And so we're only making comparisons now to the DNA that is not that person who we already know is there. It's like someone telling you, I know there are 2 cups of flour in Grandma's cookie recipe. So now you're just adjusting the other potential ingredients to see what else is making up that recipe. If their DNA profile is maybe more partial or low level, then we'll run the statistic for that individual first to make sure that it meets our threshold to put them on both sides of the seesaw, and we'll call that a conditioned contributor. It treats it the same way once we run that standard comparison. And so the propositions will list any individual that has been assumed or conditioned on as a contributor, and then it will have the two opposing scenarios for the other individuals that are being compared to the profile, and then finally the result of that comparison.
So if you had my shirt for testing, you would assume my DNA was on this shirt because you knew I was wearing the shirt.
Right. I would look at your profile first and visually compare that to the item of evidence. If you are clearly contributing to the mixture, then I will assume you. If maybe you are a lower level contributor, but it looks like your DNA profile could be there, then in order to confirm that, I will run your statistic first and then continue on with you on both sides of the seesaw.
All right, and now are there some times where you are unable to make comparisons to specific individuals?
Yes, like we mentioned earlier, if there are individuals that are related and maybe the DNA profile that we're comparing them to is lower level, or there's just not a lot of information there for a lower level contributor, we can't distinguish between them, and so we won't make comparisons in those cases to those individuals.
Okay. And I guess before we get started, just kind of going back to DNA in general, what are alleles?
So alleles are the results of our testing at a specific location. Like I explained earlier, the final step of the laboratory portion of our analysis is the separation of the DNA into a profile, and the separation is what generates those allele results.
Okay. And how many alleles are we dealing with when you're making an analysis with DNA? I guess if there are more or less, what that can tell you. If that makes sense?
I'm not sure I know what you're asking.
All right. Well, sometimes our DNA samples, you mentioned lower or higher levels of DNA there.
Mm-hmm.
Would that affect the alleles that are there?
Yes, so the alleles are the actual result that we're looking at. It's the DNA profile that we're looking at. We are evaluating the profile based upon the heights of those alleles. So the higher the allele, the potential greater contribution of that individual's DNA. The lower level the allele, the less DNA potentially from that individual in that profile.
Okay. And if you only have a few alleles to look at, is that very informative in your analysis?
No, the fewer number of alleles that you have to make comparisons, the less informative the statistic is going to be. So that's where we have it in that range where it's not tilting greatly in one direction over the other. It's kind of like trying to identify something based off of an eyewitness description. If it's very vague, like it was a red sedan, there are many red sedans that could fit that description. So that would be an example of having a few alleles. But if you have a more specific description, like it was a red sedan with 5 bumper stickers and a bedazzled license plate, that's very specific, and so you have more information to make your comparison to that vehicle.
Unrelated people share the same alleles.
Yes.
All right, so before we get to the results, some of these statistical results are very large numbers. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you think these two charts here, States Exhibit 475 and 474, would help demonstrate to the jury what we're talking about?
Yes.
State's Exhibit 474 and 475 for demonstrative purposes.
No objection.
So admitted.
Did you receive a number of bubble swabs to analyze in this case?
Yes, I did.
Do you remember how many buccal swabs the man received?
I believe there were 24 buccal swabs total that I used for comparison.
Maybe 25?
I'd have to count. There was one that I received, but I did not perform analysis on. Maybe that's the one that you're counting.
I'll have you take a look at States 463. Do you recognize that buccal swab?
Yes.
And who is that a buccal swab from?
It's labeled as buccal swabs from Nolan Tootin. There's our laboratory case number and item number on the packaging.
And you performed analysis on this buccal swab?
Yes.
State would move 463 into evidence.
No objection.
So admitted.
Now, you compared standards from these buccal swabs to swabs from items of evidence, or what do we do to analyze all this stuff?
So first we do our interpretation of the evidence. We look at the evidence like I described earlier, make sure that it's suitable for comparison, determine the number of contributors to the item, and then if it's an intimate item, we'll make that visual comparison to the individual whose body that item came from first. Then we will use StarMix to calculate the statistics for other individuals for comparison, and then it'll be a result in support of one proposition over the other.
And the other individuals for comparison would be any number of the individuals whose buccal swabs were submitted in this case?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to have you take a look at State's Exhibit 459. What is State's Exhibit 459 an item that you analyzed?
459 are our laboratory items 7.1 and 10.1.
Okay. And can you tell us what that actually is?
7.1 was the MBAC collection from cartridge cases 2 through 7, and 10.1 were the swabs from the exterior of items 9 and 10, which were shotgun shells.
And you performed analysis on both of those items?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us the results of your analysis on the MVAC collection from the 300 blackout cases? Your item 7.1. And I guess instead of just blanketly asking for the results, I'll ask, based on the comparisons you made when analyzing that item, were any individuals included?
Yes, for item 7.1, the DNA profile was interpreted as single source, And for the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the two scenarios were Margaret Murdaugh contributed the DNA profile versus an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed the DNA profile. And the result of that comparison is the DNA profile is approximately 510 billion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh contributed the profile than if an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed the profile.
And what does that mean?
It means that the likelihood ratio is in support of that first scenario of Margaret Murdaugh contributing the profile versus an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed the profile.
Okay, let's move on to the next item in that in State's Exhibit 459, the swabs from the exterior of items 9 and 10, which were these shotgun shells from the fever.
Okay.
Based on the comparisons you made, were any individuals included?
This item was also interpreted as single source, and so the scenarios were set up the same way. The person being compared contributed the profile versus an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed the profile.
And that means there's one person contributing.
Correct. For Paul Murdaugh, the result of the comparison is the DNA profile is approximately 15 octillion times more likely if Paul Murdaugh contributed the profile than if an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed the profile.
What does that mean?
Just like earlier, it's in support of that first proposition set. The DNA profile is approximately 15 octillion times more likely if Paul Murdaugh contributed the profile than if an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed the profile.
Let's move on to Exhibit 18. Which are swabs from the feed room door. Did you analyze those items? Take Exhibit 18.
Yes, I did. Item 17, you can see our laboratory number and then my initials on the seal and the date.
Right, and those are swabs from the feed room door.
It's labeled as swabs from exterior doorknob of storage room door.
All right. And based on the comparisons you made, were any individuals included?
For item 17, the comparison with Paul Murdaugh, the DNA profile was again interpreted as single source, so we're setting up the propositions in that same way. The result is the DNA profile is approximately 15 octillion times more likely if Paul Murdaugh contributed the profile than if an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed the profile.
15 octillion times more likely. An octillion has 27 zeros.
Yes.
So that's a pretty high statistical number there.
Yes.
Let's move on to Exhibit 256. Which I cannot seem to locate. They go to courts and dogs. Did you analyze item 256? which would be your items 15 and 16. Swabs of blood from Camo Benelli.
Yes, item 15.
Nature of the objection.
Foundation, she described them in the question as swabs of blood. That has not been established.
All right, response.
Your Honor, item Exhibit 256, item 15 and 16 have been admitted into evidence, even though I can't get my hands on them at the moment. And they were described as 2 swabs of suspected blood from receiver forward of the loading port from Camo Benelli Super Black Eagle 3 12-gauge shot.
Your Honor, there'd be no objection if it was the question rephrased to say suspected blood.
All right, if you restate the question, please.
I believe I misspoke, and this would be State's Exhibit 259. And what is that item?
259 contains sled items 15 and 16, which were swabs from the Camo Benelli 12-gauge shotgun.
And did you analyze those items?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Based on your comparisons that you made, were any individuals included?
For which item?
Let's start with item 15.
Item 15 was interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals. So for this comparison, we have the person being compared to the DNA profile and an unidentified, unrelated individual as the first scenario. And then the second scenario is 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the result is the DNA profile is approximately 670 octillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Richard Alexander Murdaugh, the result is, the DNA profile is approximately 10 quintillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And so now, because we have a mixture where more than one person has been included as a contributor, we run the statistic for those individuals together to make sure that the DNA profile can be explained by a contribution of DNA from all of those individuals together. So the comparisons would now be Margaret Murdaugh and Richard Alexander Murdaugh contributed to the mixture versus 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And the result of that comparison is the DNA profile is approximately 48 quindecillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and Richard Alexander Murdaugh contributed to the profile than if 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the profile.
Okay, so we have 3 different, scenarios there.
3 different comparisons being made.
And is any one of those comparisons more likely than the other?
How do you mean?
Well, can you pick out one of those comparisons as being more likely than the other comparisons?
For each of those comparisons, the individuals who were being compared were included as contributors to the mixture.
All right, let's talk about item 16, which is also a swab of suspected blood from the Camo Benelli.
For item 16, the partial DNA profile developed was insufficient for interpretation.
All right, let's move on to Exhibit 398. You'll take a look at 398.
398 contains our SLED lab numbers 22.4 and 22.5.
So item 22.4 is a reddish-brown debris swab from the right side of the receiver belonging to item 22.
Correct.
Based on the comparisons you made, were any individuals included on that item 22.4?
22.4, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals. For the comparison with Margaret Murdaugh, the result was the DNA profile is approximately 480 octillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
And what does that mean?
The result is in support of that first scenario of Margaret Murdaugh being included as a contributor to the mixture. The likelihood ratio is 480 octillion times more. The DNA profile is approximately 480 octillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
And then the next item, 22.5, is also a swab from that same shotgun from the left side.
Yes.
Okay. Based on the comparisons you made, were any individuals included?
Item 22.5, the DNA profile was also interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals. For the comparison with Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 570 octillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
75 octillion times more likely that Margaret Murdaugh contributed to that mixture.
The DNA profile is approximately 570 octillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
And now this unidentified, unrelated individual is popping up, and what does that mean again?
It's just the way that we make our calculation. We have to account for an opposing scenario to the person being compared, and then when there is a mixture, we need to account for the other individuals in that mixture when we're making our comparison, and so we use an unidentified, unrelated individual.
Did you analyze some swabs from Paul Murdaugh's cell phone? I believe that would be your item 25.1.
Yes.
And what were the results of your analysis there?
A partial DNA profile was developed due to the limited information obtained and the inability to determine the number of contributors. No further interpretation will be offered.
In State's Exhibit 83 is some swabs from a Chevy Suburban. If you could focus on your item 56, the 2 swabs of suspected blood collected from the steering wheel.
Let me try and find that. said 56? Okay. Okay, I have 56.
Okay. And you analyzed item 56?
Yes, I did.
Swabs of blood collected from the steering wheel?
They were submitted as 2 swabs of suspected blood collected from the steering wheel of the Chevy Suburban.
And based on the comparisons you made, were any individuals included?
For item 56, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the result is the DNA profile is approximately 35 times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Richard Alexander Murdaugh, the result is the DNA profile is approximately 100 quadrillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And then just like before, because we had 2 individuals who were included individually as contributors to the mixture, we have to run the comparison of them together to make sure that the DNA profile can be explained by a contribution of DNA from all of those individuals. So for that comparison, the DNA profile is approximately 240 quintillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and Richard Alexander Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. There's also a statement that because that first comparison to Margaret Murdaugh had a likelihood ratio result that is on the lower end of our scale, we want to put more emphasis on that result when comparing her as a contributor to the mixture. So the likelihood ratio for proposition set 3, which was that comparison together, was calculated to confirm that the mixture could be explained by the contribution of DNA from all individuals listed under HP, which is that first scenario. Due to the disparity in the individual likelihood ratios between the contributors for this item, it is recommended to put more weight on the results of proposition set 1, which was that comparison of Margaret Murdaugh individually, rather than the results of proposition set 3, which is the comparison of them together, when considering Margaret Murdaugh as a possible contributor to the mixture.
Hey, Zapata. This stuff's kind of confusing already, but I think that just got really confusing. So I guess if you could kind of simplify that a little bit for us.
Yes. So think about like 2 people singing the same song. If one person is singing really quietly and another person is singing loudly, when they're singing together, it'll sound really loud because that one person is already singing loudly by themselves. But that doesn't mean that the person who was singing quietly is suddenly singing very loudly. So we're trying to account for the difference in the weight of the result. And so it's just more accurate when considering that person who is a lower level or has a lower likelihood ratio to consider their individual likelihood ratio rather than the combined likelihood ratio.
So based on all of that, what is the most likely we have there?
It's not really that it's like a more likely scenario over another, it's just the result of that comparison that's being made.
So just take into all that into account.
Yes.
Okay. Let's move on to Exhibit 251, which was the left and right fingernails from Maggie Murdaugh. Take a look at Exhibit 251. Did you analyze those items? I believe item 70 is the left fingernail clippings from Maggie Murdaugh.
Yes, and 71 is the right fingernail clippings from Margaret Murdaugh.
Well, let's talk about the left fingernail clippings first. What were the results of your analysis?
Are you looking for all of the individuals who were compared?
Yes, the results, the entire results. Yes.
Okay. For item 70, a DNA profile suitable for comparison was developed. Several individuals were visually excluded from the profile first. Paul Murdaugh, Anthony Cook, Roger Davis, Rogan Gibson, Connor Cook, Philip Beach, Renee Beach, Robin Beach, John Murdaugh, Richard Alexander Murdaugh Jr. or Buster, Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Randy Murdaugh, Miley Altman, and Morgan Dowdy are excluded as contributors. Excluded as contributors. For the proposition set, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from two individuals. Because these are Margaret Murdaugh's own fingernail clippings, she is assumed as a contributor. So the two scenarios are Margaret Murdaugh, and in this case, the comparison was made to Claude CB Rowe using the StarMix software. So that first scenario is Margaret Murdaugh and Claude CB Rowe contributed to the mixture, and the second scenario is Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture.
Okay. Now, why was Claude CB Rowe included in this comparison?
So the other individuals I was able to visually exclude, which just means from looking at the DNA profile and comparing it to their standard, I could exclude them as a contributor. If an individual happens to have the alleles that, or if an individual cannot be visually excluded, so I cannot say from looking at their DNA profile, comparing it to the evidence that they are excluded, then I will run the statistic to compare them to that profile. And so that's why that comparison was made. The result of the comparison is the DNA profile is approximately 11 times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Margaret Murdaugh and Claude CB Rowe contributed to the mixture. So this is a result in support of that second scenario. It's not the first scenario like the others that we've been discussing have been.
So, how much DNA were you looking at in this sample?
Are you asking like DNA that was not attributable to Margaret?
Well, was there a small amount of DNA or a large amount of DNA under those left fingernail clippings?
There was not a lot of, there were not many alleles that were not attributable to Margaret in the profile.
So let's talk a little bit, explain about those alleles there that when you were doing your testing.
Yeah. Like I explained earlier, the alleles are the results of our test, and they will appear on in the profile that we're looking at, and they will be at different proportions based upon roughly how much DNA is present from the different possible contributors. So in this case, because they were Margaret Murdaugh's own fingernail clippings, her DNA is present in the profile at a higher level. And then we are looking at only a few alleles that were not her own alleles to make the comparison to the other individuals.
So was it 3 alleles?
Yes,
Okay.
that were not Margaret Murdaugh's alleles.
And those 3 alleles could be CB Rowe's alleles?
I could not visually exclude him, which just means when looking at his profile and comparing it to those other alleles, he did have those alleles, but it's a very low level of DNA that's being compared to him. And the result was in support of that second scenario, which was Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture.
And this courtroom here is full of people. Could anybody in this courtroom have those same 3 alleles present in that testing?
It's possible.
All right, let's move on. And let's put this other chart we have here on the screen. And the results concerning C.B. Rowe, was that moderate support for exclusion for his results?
So what you're looking at is a scale. It's representative of a verbal scale that we have on our reports, and it's showing the different ranges for the likelihood ratio results that we can obtain. So on one side, you have the likelihood ratios that are in support of that first proposition, or that first scenario, and on the other side, you have the scale for the results that are in support of that second proposition. So here, the range is 2 to 99 for moderate support for that second proposition, and his result is an 11, which falls within that 2 to 99 range.
Okay. And then the other result with just Margaret Murdaugh?
For Margaret Murdaugh, because it's her own fingernail clippings, we're not calculating a statistic. We're assuming her as the contributor.
And you also analyzed the fingernail clippings from her right hand.
Yes.
And those are up there as well. What were the results of your analysis there?
The DNA profile developed is attributable to Margaret Murdaugh.
And then State's Exhibit 252 is fingernail clippings from the right and left hands of Paul Murdaugh. If you could tell us any results from your analysis of Paul's fingernail clippings.
For both items 72 and 73, the result was the DNA profile developed is attributable to Paul Murdaugh.
Now, you also analyzed Alex Murdaugh's shirt, which is State's Exhibit 418, your item 9. And did you analyze Paul Murdaugh, or excuse me, the defendant Alex Murdaugh's pants as well?
Yes, I received cuttings from both item 19, which was the white shirt from Richard Murdaugh, and then item 20, which was a pair of green shorts from Richard Murdaugh.
And are the cuttings from the shirt and the shorts in those two exhibits up there, States 460 and 461?
This appears to be all of them. I can take them out and check, or if you would like for me to.
I believe that should be all the cuttings. And there were quite a few cuttings that you analyzed.
Yes.
So unfortunately, we're going to have to go through all of those the analysis of all of those cuttings. So let's start with the shirt in Exhibit 460, item 19.2, a cutting from the exterior front edge of Alex Murdaugh's shirt, the defendant. Based on the comparisons you made, were any individuals included?
For 19.2, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals. For the comparison with Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 460 octillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
Item 19.3, the cutting from the exterior back, bottom center of the defendant's shirt.
For 19.3, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals. For this item, I was able to assume Richard Alexander Murdaugh as a contributor. So the propositions or the scenarios that we're comparing are Richard Alexander Murdaugh and the person being compared versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 360 quadrillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and Margaret Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture.
Item 19.4.
For 19.4, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals, and this was a situation where I had to first calculate the statistic for Richard Alexander Murdaugh to see if there was enough DNA to condition on him as a contributor. So for that comparison, the DNA profile is approximately 120 quadrillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And then moving forward, with the other comparisons, I can say that Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture, and just like before, we have Richard Alexander Murdaugh and the person being compared contributed to the mixture versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Paul Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 7 octillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and Paul Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture.
And does that complete your analysis of that item?
For 19.4?
Yes.
I think that was the only one where there was inclusionary likelihood ratios. Yes.
Let's move on to 19.5, a cutting from stain B on the shirt. You could tell us about any inclusions.
This item was also interpreted, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals, and I was able to assume Richard Alexander Murdaugh as a contributor. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the result is the DNA profile is approximately 3,800 times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and Margaret Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture.
Moving on to item 19.6, a cutting from stain C on the shirt.
Okay.
us about any individuals that were included there?
For item 19.6, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 individuals. I was able to assume Richard Alexander Murdaugh as a contributor to the mixture, and so now we are comparing Richard Alexander Murdaugh, the individual being compared to the mixture, and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 570 octillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
And does that include the results of inclusion for that item?
Yes.
Item 19.7, a cutting from stain D.
For item 19.7, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 4 individuals. Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture, so I was able to assume him. And so the comparison in this case will be Richard Alexander Murdaugh, the person being compared to the mixture, and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 3 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 1.9 quadrillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 3 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. I also made a comparison to Nguyen Tutin. The DNA profile is approximately 480 septillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Nguyen Tutin, and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 3 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
And again, why was Nguyen Tutin included in the comparison?
When looking at the evidence DNA profile, I was not able to visually exclude Nguyen Tutin as a potential contributor to the mixture, and so I ran his likelihood ratio for comparison to that item. And then similarly to the other items where if an individual is included when you run their likelihood ratio on their own, I also had to do the calculation for all of those individuals together to make sure that the DNA profile can be explained by a contribution of all of those individuals. So for that comparison, the DNA profile is approximately 450 duodecillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, Nguyen Tutin, and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 3 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
Okay, item 19.8, cutting from another stain on the shirt, stain E. Just give us any individuals that were included in your results, please.
The DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 individuals. Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the result is the DNA profile is approximately 590 million times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
19.9, stain F.
For item 19.9, a DNA profile was developed. Due to the inability to determine the number of contributors, no further interpretation will be offered.
Item 19.10,
For item 19.10, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 individuals. Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 430 octillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
item 19.11, which is a coding from stain H. If you could explain any individuals who were included in your analysis.
So for item 19.11, the only individual who had an inclusionary likelihood ratio, first, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals. Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture. For the comparison to Hipólito Torres, the DNA profile is approximately 10 times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and Hipólito Torres contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture.
So, with Mr. Torres, I guess if we could look back at this chart and tell us where he would fall along there.
The likelihood ratio for his comparison under those propositions was 10, which falls under our weak support for that first scenario.
So would that be trending towards exclusion?
It's on, it's in support of that first scenario on this side, the green side of the scale.
The green side?
But it's 10. So that very first arrow indicates weak support for that scenario. The range is 2 to 99.
Okay. So,
And his likelihood ratio, when compared to the DNA profile, the DNA profile is approximately 10 times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and Hipólito Torres contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture.
and I don't want you to repeat that same thing again, but could you kind of, I guess, clarify what that means?
When making my comparison to the evidence DNA profile, I was not able to visually exclude Hipólito Torres as a possible contributor to the mixture, and so I ran the statistic for his comparison. And the result of that comparison is in support of the first scenario. The DNA profile is approximately 10 times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and Hipólito Torres contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture. So it's just tilting that seesaw 10 in that direction.
Okay, we have two cuttings left from the shirt. Item 19.12 is a cutting from stain I. Based on the comparisons you made, were any individuals included?
19.12, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from two individuals. Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 1.3 nonillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and Margaret Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture.
And then item 19.13, a cutting from stain J of the defendant's shirt.
For item 19.13, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 individuals. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 1.5 sextillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. So this is one where I was not able to assume Richard Alexander Murdaugh as a contributor, so I am comparing each person individually. For the comparison to Paul Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 24 quintillion times more likely if Paul Murdaugh and 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Richard Alexander Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 29 times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And like before, because there were multiple individuals who were included as contributors when compared individually, I have to calculate the statistic for them together. For that comparison, the DNA profile is approximately 260 quindecillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh, Paul Murdaugh, and Richard Alexander Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And similarly to that other item where there was an individual with a lower likelihood ratio, there is that statement about the recommendation to put more weight on the results of Proposition Set 3, which was the comparison to Richard Alexander Murdaugh, rather than the results of Proposition Set 4 when considering Richard Alexander Murdaugh as a possible contributor to the mixture.
All right. So, in addition to this shirt being analyzed for DNA, Agent Nguyen told the jury a little bit about it being tested for blood. Can you explain what you did to test this shirt for the presence of blood?
I was asked to perform a hemotrace test on the cuttings from the shirt. As Ms. Nguyen described, it's our confirmatory test for blood. It works similarly to a pregnancy test or a COVID test. One line in the control area is a negative result, a line in the control area, and the test area would be a positive result.
That is testing with hemotrace?
Yes.
And what were the results of the hemotrace testing on all of the items that you just discussed to the jury?
For items 19.2 through 19.13, the result was no human blood identified.
And could you explain that to us? We had presumptive testing for blood, and then some other testing, and then the hemotrace, which says there was no blood. So what does that mean?
So presumptive tests are sensitive but not very specific. Like discussed earlier, there are possible false positives for presumptive tests. If we're requested to, we can perform a confirmatory test, which is more specific but is less sensitive.
So in your opinion, if there was blood on that shirt, could testing such as with LCV have diluted any blood on the shirt?
I am aware of some studies that have been performed on hemotrace testing after LCV that suggests that there is a possible interaction with the LCV and the hemotrace test, and it is possible for there to be amounts of hemoglobin that would not be detected by the test that would give a negative result. But the results of my testing were negative.
And as we've discussed, testing for blood and testing for DNA is different.
Yes.
All right. You also tested the defendant's pants.
Yes.
Did you test those in a similar manner to the way you would test the cuttings from the shirt?
Do you mean for DNA?
Yes.
Yes.
That would be State's Exhibit 418, the defendant's pants, and the cuttings, items Exhibits 460 and 461. Your items 20.2. Sorry.
Sorry, wrong report. Okay.
So I guess as briefly as we can, let's discuss some of the results from the cuttings from those pants. Item 20.2 is a cutting from the front left interior pocket of the defendant's pants. Were any individuals included?
So for item 20.2, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 individuals. This was one where I calculated his likelihood ratio to see if I could condition on him as a contributor. So the result of that comparison is the DNA profile is approximately 140 quadrillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And so then for the comparisons to the other individuals, Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture, and the scenarios are Richard Alexander Murdaugh, the person being compared, and an unidentified unrelated individual contributed to the mixture, versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 5.1 sextillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and an unidentified unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Paul Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 25 quintillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Paul Murdaugh, and an unidentified unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And for the comparison of all those individuals together, the DNA profile is approximately 2 quindecillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and Paul Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
The next cutting is item 20.3, a cutting from stain A on the defendant's pants.
For 20.3, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 individuals. Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 94 septillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and an unidentified unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
All right, 20.4, cutting from stain G from the defendant's pants. You could tell us if any individuals were included in that analysis.
For 20.4, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 individuals. Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 24 sextillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
Was that the only comparison for that item?
That was the only,
Inclusion?
yes, for that item.
Let's move to the next one. I think that would be 20.5, a cutting from stain C from the defendant's pants. You can please tell us if any individuals were included.
For 20.5, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 2 individuals. Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture. For the comparison to Paul Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 4.1 septillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and Paul Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture.
I think we have 3 left. Item 20.6, a cutting from stain D from the defendant's pants.
The DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 individuals. This was one where I was not able to assume Richard Alexander Murdaugh as a contributor, so I'm making the comparisons to each person individually.
And you can't assume him. Why?
When making that comparison, it seems that his DNA may be present, but at a low level, so I cannot assume him as a contributor. So I would run his likelihood ratio to see if I could condition, but in this case, it was not high enough to meet our threshold to condition, so I'm just comparing him to the profile like every other individual. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 930 quintillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and an unidentified, unrelated individual, The DNA profile is approximately 930 quintillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Paul Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 38 quintillion times more likely if Paul Murdaugh and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Richard Alexander Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 190 times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And then we're calculating the statistic for all of those individuals together. The DNA profile is approximately 8.7 quindecillion times more likely if Margaret Murdaugh, Paul Murdaugh, and Richard Alexander Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And there is that same statement about putting more weight on the individual likelihood ratio for Richard Alexander Murdaugh when considering him as a contributor rather than the combined.
Item 20.7, hopefully that should be an easy one.
For 20.7, a DNA profile was developed. Due to the inability to determine the number of contributors, no further interpretation will be offered.
And then lastly, item 20.8, a cutting from stain F of defendant's pants.
For 20.8, the DNA profile was interpreted as a mixture originating from 3 individuals. I calculated the likelihood ratio for Richard Alexander Murdaugh to see if it met our threshold to condition on him as a contributor. The result for his comparison is the DNA profile is approximately 320 million times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and 2 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture than if 3 unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And then we're making comparisons to the other individuals. I'm including him as a contributor. So Richard Alexander Murdaugh is contributing to the mixture. For the comparison to Margaret Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 2.6 sextillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and two unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. For the comparison to Paul Murdaugh, the DNA profile is approximately 17 quintillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Paul Murdaugh, and an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and two unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture. And then once again, we're calculating the likelihood ratio of all of those individuals contributing to the mixture together. The DNA profile is approximately 93 quattuordecillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Margaret Murdaugh, and Paul Murdaugh contributed to the mixture than if Richard Alexander Murdaugh and two unidentified, unrelated individuals contributed to the mixture.
All right. Now, as far as the shorts or defendant's pants go, did you do any confirmatory testing on those with Hemotrace?
No, I did not.
Exhibit 419 is the defendant's shoes, which is item 21. And in exhibit 460, I believe it's up here in some of this. Exhibit 460. Okay. Can you tell us what is contained, if a cutting from the left shoelace of the defendant's shoes is contained in that exhibit?
Yes, 21.2 is part of this container.
And did you analyze the cutting from that shoelace?
Yes.
Okay. And were any individuals included in your results there?
The DNA profile was interpreted as single source for the comparison to Richard Alexander Murdaugh. The result is the DNA profile is approximately 410 septillion times more likely if Richard Alexander Murdaugh contributed the profile than if an unidentified, unrelated individual contributed the profile.
And did you also get some swabs from a raincoat?
Yes, I did.
That would be case exhibit 462. 2 swabs from a blue raincoat. Your items 173.2 and 173.3.
Yes.
And you analyzed those items?
Yes, I did.
Item 173.2 from the raincoat appears to be swabs from the interior cuffs, collar, hood, and interior zipper areas and zipper pull of the blue raincoat. Could you tell us the results of your analysis of that item?
No.
Swab?
Sorry. No DNA profile was developed.
And then item 173.3, swabs from the side opening, zipper area, and both interior portions of exterior pocket of blue raincoat.
A partial DNA profile was developed due to the limited information obtained and the inability to determine the number of contributors. No further interpretation will be offered.
Okay, Agent Zapata, thank you so much for going through all that with us. We have no further questions for you at this time.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll break for lunch now and resume at 2:30.
Remain in order.
All right, ma'am, you may step down. Please do not discuss your testimony with anyone over lunch. And we're in recess till
All right.
2:30.